When Margaret Chen inherited 47 acres of worthless Nevada desert from a great-uncle she'd never met, she had no idea that beneath that barren soil lay an underground bunker containing classified presidential documents that would expose the truth about what really happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis and force America to rewrite Cold War history. Before we dive deeper into Margaret's incredible discovery, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And if stories like this inspire you, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I've got something even more shocking lined up for you. Margaret Chen stood in the kitchen of her cramped Sacramento apartment, staring at the certified letter that had arrived that morning like a twisted punchline to the worst year of her life. The official letterhead from Hartwell Associates. Estate attorneys looked important enough, but the contents read like something from a bad comedy sketch. Dear Mrs. Chen, we regret to inform you of the passing of your great-uncle, Clarence Wong. As per his last will and testament, you have inherited his property located at coordinates 37.2419 Nguyen, 116.0419 W in Nye County, Nevada. The property consists of 47 acres of undeveloped desert land with no structures, utilities, or road access. Current assessed value, $1,200. Annual property taxes, $847. Margaret laughed bitterly at the absurdity. 47 acres that cost more in taxes than they were worth. A great-uncle she'd never heard of, let alone met. Desert land in the middle of nowhere, Nevada, that she couldn't afford to keep and probably couldn't give away. The timing felt like the universe's idea of a practical joke. 3 months earlier, her husband David had lost his 2-year battle with pancreatic cancer, leaving behind medical bills that had consumed their life savings, retirement funds, and everything they'd worked. 32 years to build together. The life insurance payout had barely covered the funeral costs and outstanding debts that continued arriving in the mail like cruel reminders of their shattered dreams. Margaret set the letter down on the kitchen counter that doubled as her dining table, her workspace, and her entire living area in this 450-square-foot studio apartment that felt like a coffin compared to the 4-bedroom colonial house they'd lost to medical bankruptcy 6 months earlier. The apartment came furnished with a Murphy bed that barely fit the wall space, a kitchenette with 2 burners and a mini-fridge, and a single window that looked out onto the apartment complex's dumpster area. Now, at 54 years old, Margaret was working 2 part-time jobs, morning shifts at Medibill Solutions processing insurance claims and evening shifts at Pacific Coast Call Center handling customer complaints for a cable company. Between the 2 jobs, she was pulling down about $2,100 per month, barely enough to cover the $975 rent, utilities, groceries, and the prescription medications she needed for the high blood pressure and chronic anxiety that had developed during David's illness. The letter continued with bureaucratic cheerfulness. Please contact our office within 30 days to discuss property transfer procedures. Be advised that failure to assume ownership will result in the property reverting to the state of Nevada for unpaid tax obligations. Annual property taxes of $847 will become your responsibility upon transfer completion. Margaret crumpled the letter and threw it toward the overflowing trash can beside her tiny refrigerator, missing by 3 feet. Even inheriting land was another problem she couldn't afford to solve. The annual property taxes were nearly as much as she paid for this apartment each month, and she was already choosing between groceries and prescription medications most weeks. $847. That was more than she spent on food in 2 months, more than she'd managed to save in the entire year since David's death. More than the security deposit she'd need to find a better apartment. Not that she could afford higher rent anyway. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter Jessica, a third-year nursing student in Portland. "Mom, how are you holding up? I know today would have been Dad's 57th birthday. Thinking of you both." Margaret's heart clenched. She'd forgotten. In the chaos of working 14-hour days just to survive, she'd lost track of the date that would have been David's birthday. The man who'd promised her they'd travel the country in an RV when they retired, visiting national parks and small towns they'd only seen in magazines. The man who'd planned to teach their future grandchildren how to fish at the lake where he'd grown up. The man who died apologizing for the medical bills he couldn't control, begging her forgiveness for leaving her with debt instead of security. She typed back with trembling fingers, "I'm okay, sweetie. Just dealing with some paperwork stuff. Love you so much." It was a lie, but Jessica was struggling with her own student loans, clinical rotations, and the stress of nursing school. Margaret refused to become another burden on her daughter's shoulders. Jessica had already taken out additional loans to help with David's medical expenses during his final months, sacrificing her own financial future to help save a father who couldn't be saved. Margaret walked to the single window and looked out at the November evening, watching other residents of the Sunset Manor apartments come home from their own struggles. Mrs. Rodriguez from 2B worked 3 cleaning jobs to support her grandchildren. Mr. Patterson from across the hall was 82 and still bagging groceries. Because Social Security wasn't enough, everyone here was hanging on by threads, doing whatever it took to avoid homelessness in a city where rent increased faster than wages. The inherited land letter sat crumpled on the floor, mocking her with its bureaucratic language and impossible demands. Margaret picked it up, smoothed it out, and read it again, trying to make sense of a great uncle she'd never heard of and property she couldn't afford to own. That evening, after 8 hours of explaining insurance denials to frustrated patients, at the call center, Margaret sat at her tiny kitchen table with her laptop, Googling Nye County, Nevada land values out of morbid curiosity. What she found was exactly what she'd expected. Her inheritance was indeed worthless. The coordinates placed the property roughly 60 miles northwest of Las Vegas, in the middle of the Nevada desert, hours from any town, with no water rights, no utilities, and no access road. Similar parcels were listed for sale online for months or years with no buyers. Even if she could find someone willing to take it off her hands, the legal fees for transferring ownership would probably exceed any potential sale price. Real estate websites showed satellite images of endless brown desert, punctuated by scrub, brush, and the occasional dirt road, leading to abandoned mining claims or government installations. The landscape looked like something from another planet, barren, hostile, and utterly uninhabitable. Margaret clicked through to the county assessor's records, finding minimal information about the property, purchased in 1962 by Clarence Wong for $3,200. No structures listed, no permits on file, no utilities ever connected, no improvements recorded. Just 47 acres of nothing that had somehow cost her mysterious great-uncle what would be nearly $30,000 in today's money. The more Margaret researched, the more questions arose. Why would anyone pay that much for worthless desert land in 1962? And why would he hold on to it for 61 years, paying taxes annually on property that generated no income and had no apparent value? The tax record showed he'd never missed a payment, never let the property go into arrears, never tried to sell or develop the land. Margaret pulled up her family tree research from Ancestry.com, trying to understand her connection to this Clarence Wong. Her mother's side of the family had been complex. Her grandmother had been born Wong Lee May in San Francisco's Chinatown in 1923, but had taken the name Linda Wang when she married. The family had scattered during World War II, some going to internment camps, others moving east or changing their names to avoid discrimination. Clarence Wong appeared to be her grandmother's younger brother, born in 1925. According to the records, Margaret could find he'd served in the US Army during World War II and Korea, then seemed to disappear from public records after 1962. No marriage certificates, no children, no death certificate until last month. He'd lived like a ghost for over 60 years, paying taxes on worthless land and leaving no trace of his existence. Margaret stared at the satellite images of her inheritance. 47 acres of brown dirt and scattered vegetation that looked like the surface of Mars. No buildings, no roads, no signs that humans had ever set foot on the property. Just endless desert stretching to barren mountains in the distance, with the occasional dirt track used by off-road enthusiasts or government vehicles. But as she zoomed in on the aerial photographs, something caught her attention. In the center of the property, barely visible in the grainy satellite image, was what appeared to be a small rectangular area where the vegetation looked different, darker, more organized, as if something had been buried and the earth had settled differently over the decades. Margaret adjusted her laptop screen and squinted at the image, probably just a rock formation or an artifact from the photography angle. But the shape looked oddly geometric, too regular to be natural. She switched between different satellite image providers, Google Earth, Bing Maps, county GIS systems, and the anomaly appeared in all of them. She spent the next 2 hours researching Nevada land records, trying to understand what might have been built on desert property in 1962. What she found made her heart race with a mixture of excitement and dread. 62 was the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world had teetered on the brink of nuclear war for 13 terrifying days in October. It was also the height of Cold War paranoia, when the federal government was secretly building fallout shelters, missile silos, and military installations throughout the American Southwest. The Nevada test site, where the government conducted atmospheric nuclear weapons testing, was less than 50 miles from her property. Margaret discovered that the federal government had purchased or leased thousands of acres of Nevada desert during the late 1950s and early 1960s for national security purposes. Many of these installations were never publicly acknowledged, built in remote locations to avoid public scrutiny and potential Soviet surveillance. Could Clarence Wong's property have been involved in some kind of government installation? The timing was certainly suspicious. Purchased in 1962, the same year the Cuban Missile Crisis brought America closer to nuclear war than ever before or since. The location was perfect for a classified installation, remote, isolated, with no neighbors for miles in any direction. But why would a Chinese-American veteran own property that might have been connected to classified government activities? And why would he hold on to it for 60 years without ever developing it or trying to sell it? Margaret's practical side told her to sign whatever papers would transfer the property to the state and walk away. She couldn't afford the taxes, couldn't afford to visit the property, and certainly couldn't afford to do anything with 47 acres of desert. The smart thing would be to cut her losses and focus on the daily struggle of survival in Sacramento. But something nagged at her about the mysterious rectangular shape in the satellite photos and the strange timing of Clarence Wong's original purchase. The more she researched Cold War history, the more she realized how much had been hidden from the American people during those dangerous decades. Classified installations, secret programs, covert operations that wouldn't be revealed for decades, if ever. What if Clarence Wong had been involved in something significant? What if the property contained evidence of classified activities that had never been publicly acknowledged? What if her worthless inheritance was actually priceless from a historical perspective? Margaret looked around her tiny apartment, taking inventory of her pathetic circumstances. She had $847 in her checking account, exactly enough to pay the annual property taxes if she skipped groceries for the next month. She had a 12-year-old Honda Civic that needed new tires but still ran reliably. She had vacation days accumulated from her jobs that she'd never been able to afford to use. Most importantly, she had nothing left to lose. David was gone. Their house was gone. Their dreams were gone. She was 54 years old, working 2 dead-end jobs, living in a studio apartment that felt like solitary confinement, with no prospects for anything better in the foreseeable future. Maybe it was time to stop accepting defeat and start looking for answers. Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. She called in sick to both jobs for Friday, withdrew $300 from her checking account for gas and a cheap motel, a room, and started planning a drive to Nevada to see her worthless inheritance with her own eyes. She packed a cooler with sandwiches, filled several water bottles, and threw camping gear into her Honda, a sleeping bag, folding chair, and basic tools that David had accumulated over the years. If she was going to lose the property to unpaid taxes anyway, she might as well satisfy her curiosity about what Clarence Wong had thought was worth $30,000 in the middle of nowhere. If there was nothing there, she'd sign the papers transferring ownership to the state and try to forget about the whole thing. But if there was something, anything, that might explain why a Chinese-American veteran had spent 60 years paying taxes on worthless land, Margaret was going to find it. She had no idea that her desperate financial situation and morbid curiosity about a dead relative she'd never met would lead her to one of the most significant discoveries in modern American history. She couldn't have imagined that beneath those 47 acres of barren desert lay an underground bunker containing classified documents that would expose presidential secrets from the Cold War's most dangerous moments. She couldn't have foreseen that her discovery would ultimately lead to congressional investigations, the declassification of thousands of government documents, and a fundamental re-examination of American foreign policy during the nuclear age. She had no way of knowing that her worthless inheritance would transform her from a struggling widow into one of the most important whistleblowers in American history. All Margaret knew was that she was tired of feeling powerless, tired of being beaten down by circumstances beyond her control, and tired of accepting that life would never be anything more than a daily struggle for survival. If she was going to lose everything anyway, she might as well lose it on her own terms, chasing answers to questions that had been buried in the Nevada desert for 60 years. Tomorrow morning, she would drive southeast toward Las Vegas, then north into the desert, following GPS coordinates to 47 acres of land that might hold the key to understanding what really happened during the 13 days when America and the Soviet Union stared at each other across the nuclear abyss. The barren desert was waiting, and beneath it, secrets that had been buried since the Cuban Missile Crisis were about to see daylight for the first time since President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev played chess with the fate of human civilization. Margaret Chen was about to discover that some inheritances are worth far more than their assessed value, and that sometimes the most worthless-looking gifts contain the most valuable truths. The morning alarm shrieked at 5:30 a.m., jolting Margaret from another restless night of anxiety dreams where medical bills chased her through empty hospital corridors. She'd been having variations of the same nightmare for months. Sometimes it was debt collectors knocking down doors. Sometimes it was eviction notices multiplying like cancer cells. Sometimes it was David's voice calling for help from somewhere she couldn't reach. Margaret silenced the alarm and lay in the Murphy bed that dominated her studio apartment, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had grown larger since the upstairs neighbor's bathtub had overflowed 3 weeks ago. The landlord, Mr. Petrosky, had promised to fix it soon, which in Sunset Manor Apartments language meant never unless it starts actually raining inside your unit. She pulled herself upright, her back protesting the cheap mattress that had come with the furnished apartment. Everything in her life had been downgraded, from a sleep number bed to a mattress that felt like it was stuffed with concrete blocks, from a house with 2 bathrooms to sharing a wall with neighbors whose every conversation was audible, from a kitchen where she'd hosted Thanksgiving dinners for 12 to a kitchenette where she could barely fit a microwave meal. The inheritance letter sat on her tiny dining table, really just a fold-out card table with 2 mismatched chairs, next to the stack of bills she'd been avoiding. Electric bill, overdue. Phone bill, final notice. Credit card payments, minimum amount circled in red ink. The mathematics of poverty were relentless and unforgiving. Margaret made instant coffee with tap water heated in the microwave. A morning ritual that reminded her daily of how far she'd fallen. David had been a coffee snob, grinding beans fresh every morning, brewing perfect cups in the French press he'd bought for their 20th anniversary. That French press, along with everything else of value, had been sold during the medical bankruptcy. Proceedings. As she sipped the bitter instant coffee, Margaret's mind drifted back to how they'd gotten here, to the series of small disasters that had avalanched into complete financial ruin. It had started so innocuously, David mentioning that he'd been feeling tired lately, that his stomach had been bothering him after meals. Nothing dramatic, nothing that seemed like an emergency. The first doctor's visit had been routine, probably. Just stress from his job as a mechanical engineer at an aerospace manufacturing company. Maybe acid reflux, maybe he needed to cut back on spicy food and get more sleep. The doctor had prescribed antacids and suggested lifestyle changes, but the fatigue had gotten worse. David, who had once worked 12-hour days and still had energy to help neighbors with home repair projects, started falling asleep on the couch after dinner. He lost 15 pounds without trying, then 20, then 30. His skin took on a greyish pallor that made Margaret's chest tight with worry. The second doctor's visit had led to blood tests. The blood tests had led to more tests. The tests had led to specialist appointments that required taking time off work, driving to medical centres across the city, sitting in waiting rooms filled with people who all looked like they were carrying the same terrible secret. Margaret remembered the exact moment their lives had changed forever. October 15th, 2:30 p.m., Dr. Harrison's office on the 3rd floor of the Riverside Medical Building. David had been sitting in the chair next to her, holding her hand with fingers that had become skeletal over the previous months. Dr. Harrison had looked at them with the expression of a man who delivered life-destroying news several times a week. "I'm afraid it's pancreatic cancer," he'd said, and the words had hit Margaret like a physical blow. "Stage 4. It's already metastasized to the liver and lymph nodes. Stage 4. Margaret had learned that stage 4 meant there was no stage 5, no higher number to climb toward. Stage 4 meant they were out of time before they'd even realized time was running out. The treatment options had been limited and expensive. Experimental therapies not covered by insurance. Specialist oncologists who demanded payment upfront. Clinical trials in other states that would require relocating for months at a time. Their health insurance, which they'd thought was comprehensive, turned out to have gaps large enough to drive a family into bankruptcy. David had wanted to fight. Margaret had supported his decision, even as she watched their savings account drain, like water through a broken dam. The first round of chemotherapy had cost $47,000, with insurance covering $31,000. The second round had been $52,000, with insurance covering less because they'd hit their annual maximum. The third round had cost $58,000, and by then their insurance company was denying claims and demanding pre-authorizations for every procedure. Margaret had become an expert in medical billing, insurance appeals, and financial assistance programs. She'd spent hours on hold with insurance companies, arguing with representatives who seemed trained to deny everything on the first try. She'd filled out forms for hospital charity care, pharmaceutical company assistance programs, and non-profit organizations that helped cancer patients with expenses. But the money had kept flowing out faster than it came in. They'd refinanced their house twice, pulling out equity to pay for treatments. They'd maxed out credit cards, borrowed against David's 401k, and taken loans from family members who could barely afford to help. Jessica had taken out additional student loans to contribute to her father's medical expenses, sacrificing her own financial future for treatments that ultimately couldn't save him. The experimental therapy at Johns Hopkins had cost $78,000 for a 6-week program. Insurance had covered none of it. Margaret had sold her engagement ring, David's vintage car collection, and everything of value they'd accumulated over 32 years of marriage. They'd held garage sales, liquidated investments, and borrowed money from friends who gradually stopped returning their calls. Through it all, David had kept apologizing. "I'm sorry, Maggie," he'd whisper during the nights when pain medication couldn't touch the agony that was consuming him from the inside out. "I'm sorry I'm costing us everything. I'm sorry I can't work. I'm sorry I'm leaving you with this mess." Margaret had held his hand in those dark moments, promising him that money didn't matter, that they'd figure it out, that the only thing that mattered was fighting for more time together. But privately, she'd lain awake, calculating and recalculating their debts, trying to find mathematical solutions to an equation that had no solution. The end had come faster than anyone had predicted. David had gone from walking and talking normally to unconscious in the ICU in less than a week. The final hospital bill had been $127,000 for 8 days of intensive care that everyone knew wouldn't save him. Margaret had signed the consent forms anyway, because the alternative was letting him die without trying everything possible. David had died on a Tuesday morning in March, holding Margaret's hand while machines beeped softly around them. His last words had been, "Take care of yourself, Maggie. Don't let them take everything," Margaret had promised, not knowing that everything was already gone. The life insurance payout had been $50,000, enough to cover the funeral expenses and a small fraction of their medical debt. The medical bankruptcy had eliminated most of the remaining debt, but it had also eliminated their credit rating, their house, and any prospect of financial recovery in the foreseeable future. Now, sitting in her studio apartment with instant coffee and a letter about inheriting worthless land, Margaret tried to make sense of how completely her life had been dismantled. 9 months ago, she'd been Margaret Chen, wife of 32 years, homeowner, middle-class suburban resident with a steady job and retirement savings. Today, she was Margaret Chen, widow, renter of a studio apartment, working 2 part-time jobs to afford basic survival. The transformation had been so complete and so rapid that she sometimes felt like she was living someone else's life. The woman who had hosted neighborhood barbecues and planned European vacations and worried about property taxes on a 4-bedroom house couldn't possibly be the same person who now counted quarters to do laundry and bought generic groceries with manufacturers' coupons. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor at Medibill Solutions. "Can you cover Sharon's shift today? She called in sick and we're swamped." Margaret looked at the inheritance letter, then at her meager bank account balance on her phone app. She couldn't afford to miss work, but she also couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious property in Nevada and the questions that had kept her awake most of the night. She texted back, "I'm dealing with a family emergency today. Can work extra hours tomorrow to make up for it." It wasn't entirely a lie. The inheritance was technically a family matter, even if the family member was a stranger. Margaret spent the next hour researching everything she could find about Clarence Wong, trying to understand her connection to this man who had apparently thought she was worthy of inheriting his life's one significant possession. The family records she could access online painted a picture of a man who had lived almost entirely off the radar of official documentation. Born in San Francisco in 1925, Clarence Wong had been the youngest of 4 children born to Chinese immigrants who had arrived in California during the early 1900s. His parents, Wong Kai-ming and Li Mei-ling, had operated a small grocery store in Chinatown until World War II, when anti-Asian sentiment and wartime restrictions had forced many Chinese-American businesses to close. Clarence had enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1943 at age 18, serving in the Pacific Theater during World War II. His military records showed he'd been assigned to the Signal Corps, specializing in radio communications and cryptography. After the war, he'd remained in the military, serving during the Korean conflict as a communications specialist with a top-secret security clearance. That's where the official record became sparse. After 1953, Clarence Wong seemed to disappear from conventional documentation. No employment records, no marriage licenses, no property purchases except for the Nevada land in 1962. He'd continued paying taxes on the property annually, always on time, always in full, but had left no trace of how he'd earned the money to pay those taxes. The few family members Margaret could identify through genealogy websites had scattered across the country after World War II. Some had changed their names to avoid discrimination. Others had moved to cities where Chinese-American communities were more established. Several had been lost to wars, illness, or simply the passage of time and the breakdown of extended family connections. Margaret's grandmother, Linda Wang, had rarely talked about her family of origin. She'd married Margaret's grandfather in 1946 and had seemed determined to assimilate completely into American culture, speaking only English at home and avoiding discussions of Chinese traditions or family history. Margaret now realized that her grandmother's silence about her background had probably been a survival strategy during an era when Asian Americans faced systematic discrimination and suspicion. But why had Clarence Wong chosen Margaret as his sole heir? They'd never met, never corresponded, never even knew of each other's existence until the inheritance letter arrived. Margaret's best guess was that she was simply the last surviving relative that Clarence's attorney had been able to locate through genealogy research, the end of a family line that had been scattered by history and circumstance. The Nevada property itself remained a puzzle. In 1962, $3,200 had been a substantial sum, equivalent to nearly $30,000 in today's purchasing power. For a man who appeared to have no visible source of income after leaving the military, it represented a significant investment in what appeared to be completely worthless land. Margaret pulled up historical maps of Nevada from the 1960s, trying to understand what might have made the property valuable to someone with Clarence's background in military communications. The location was roughly 60 miles northwest of Las Vegas, in an area that had been largely empty desert until the federal government began establishing military installations throughout Nevada during the Cold War. The Nevada test site, where the government had conducted atmospheric nuclear weapons testing throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, was less than 50 miles from Clarence's property. Mercury Test Site, Nellis Air Force Base, and numerous classified installations had been built throughout the region during the same period when Clarence had purchased his land. More intriguingly, Margaret discovered that the federal government had established a network of communication and monitoring stations throughout the Nevada desert during the late 1950s and early 1960s, designed to coordinate nuclear testing, monitor Soviet activities, and maintain secure communications during the heightened tensions of the Cold War. Many of these installations had been staffed by former military personnel with communications and cryptography backgrounds, exactly matching Clarence Wong's service record. Margaret began to wonder if Clarence's property had been connected to Cold War military activities that had never been publicly acknowledged. The timing was certainly suggestive. Purchased in 1962, the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when America and the Soviet Union had come closer to nuclear war than ever before or since. During those 13 days in October 1962, when President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev had played nuclear chess with the fate of human civilization, secure communications and intelligence gathering had been absolutely critical to avoiding global catastrophe. Every piece of information about Soviet capabilities, intentions, and military movements had been vital to the decision-making process that had ultimately pulled both superpowers back from the nuclear brink. What if Clarence Wong had been part of that effort? What if his property had housed a classified communication station or monitoring facility that had played a role in resolving the Cuban Missile Crisis? What if the mysterious rectangular anomaly visible in satellite photos was actually the remains of a buried installation that had been decommissioned and hidden after the crisis had passed? Margaret realized she was speculating wildly, but the pieces seemed to fit together in a way that made her heart race with excitement and fear. If her inheritance was connected to classified Cold War activities, it might contain historical evidence of enormous significance, documents, equipment, or records that could shed new light on how America had navigated the most dangerous moment in human history. But it could also contain secrets that powerful people had spent 60 years trying to keep buried. Secrets that might have national security implications, or that might embarrass government officials who were still alive, or that might reveal activities that had never been officially acknowledged. Margaret looked around her tiny apartment, taking inventory of her life and options. She had nothing to lose and potentially everything to gain. The worst-case scenario was that she'd waste a tank of gas and a day off work to look at empty desert. The best-case scenario was that she'd uncover historical evidence that could transform her understanding of American Cold War history. There was also a middle scenario that Margaret was trying not to think about too carefully: the possibility that she might find something valuable enough to solve her financial problems. If the property contained artifacts or documents with historical significance, they might be worth enough money to get her out of poverty and give her a chance to rebuild her life. Margaret made her decision with the same determination that had carried her through 2 years of David's medical crisis. She would drive to Nevada, locate the property, and investigate whatever Clarence Wong had thought was worth protecting for 60 years. If there was nothing there, she'd come home and sign the papers, transferring ownership to the state. If there was something significant, she'd figure out what to do with it. She packed methodically, like David had taught her during their camping years. Extra water, non-perishable food, basic tools, first aid supplies, and emergency equipment. The Nevada desert was not forgiving to unprepared visitors, especially a 54-year-old woman traveling alone with no cell phone coverage and no backup plan. Margaret loaded her Honda Civic with supplies and printed out detailed maps showing the route to Clarence's property. GPS would be unreliable in the remote desert areas, and she couldn't afford to get lost or stranded. She'd told Jessica she was taking a short trip to settle some estate matters, which was technically true even if it didn't convey the full scope of what she was planning. As she locked her apartment and walked to her car, Margaret felt a mixture of terror and excitement that she hadn't experienced since the early days of David's diagnosis, when they'd still believed that fighting and determination could overcome any obstacle. She was about to drive into the unknown, chasing answers to questions that might not have answers, following clues that might lead nowhere. But for the first time in months, Margaret felt like she was taking action instead of just surviving. She was actively pursuing something instead of passively accepting whatever life decided to do to her next. Whether she found treasure or just more problems in the Nevada desert, she would be finding them on her own terms. The 4-hour drive southeast toward Las Vegas would give her time to think, to plan, and to prepare for whatever she might discover on 47 acres of supposedly worthless land that had been important enough for a mysterious great-uncle to protect for 60 years. Margaret had no idea that she was about to uncover evidence of presidential decision-making during the Cuban Missile Crisis that would force historians to reconsider fundamental assumptions about how America had navigated the nuclear age. She couldn't have imagined that her desperate financial situation and curiosity about a dead relative would transform her into one of the most important whistleblowers in modern American history. All she knew was that she was tired of being a victim of circumstances beyond her control and ready to find out what Clarence Wong had considered worth preserving beneath the Nevada desert. The answers were waiting, buried under 60 years of secrecy and desert sand, and Margaret Chen was about to dig them up. Margaret spent the rest of Thursday diving deeper into research that was becoming more intriguing and more disturbing with every discovery. What had started as idle curiosity about a worthless inheritance was evolving into something that felt like investigating a decades-old mystery with potentially explosive implications. She'd called in sick to both jobs, burning precious paid time, off that she couldn't afford to lose. But the questions surrounding Clarence Wong and his Nevada property had become impossible to ignore. Every answer she found led to 3 new questions, and every new question suggested that her great-uncle had been involved in something far more significant than managing worthless desert real estate. Margaret's laptop was overheating from hours of continuous use, and her tiny kitchen table was covered with printed documents, handwritten notes, and maps that she'd been cross-referencing like a detective working a cold case. The inheritance letter sat in the center of it all, the coordinates 37.419 kn 116.490 W circled in red ink like the X marking a treasure map. The more Margaret researched Cold War history, the more she realized how much had been hidden from the American people during those dangerous decades. Classified operations, secret installations, covert programs that wouldn't be revealed for generations, if ever. The government had been conducting activities throughout the American Southwest that were never publicly acknowledged, using private property and civilian cover to hide military and intelligence operations from both the American people and potential Soviet surveillance. Nevada had been ground zero for these classified activities. The state's vast, empty spaces, sparse population, and federal land holdings had made it perfect for testing nuclear weapons, training military personnel, and establishing communication networks that could operate without public scrutiny. The Nevada Test Site alone had conducted over 900 nuclear weapons tests between 1951 and 1992, most of them completely classified until decades later. But Margaret was discovering that the nuclear testing had been only the most visible part of a much larger network of classified installations throughout Nevada. Communication stations, monitoring facilities, research laboratories, and coordination centers had been scattered across the state, often disguised as mining operations, ranches, or simply unmarked buildings in the middle of nowhere. The timing of Clarence Wong's 1962 land purchase was becoming more significant the more Margaret learned about that pivotal year in Cold War history. 1962 hadn't just been the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It had been a year of massive expansion in America's intelligence and communication capabilities, driven by the terrifying realization that nuclear war could begin and end in a matter of hours. President Kennedy had been shocked to discover during the Cuban Missile Crisis how little accurate intelligence the United States actually possessed about Soviet capabilities and intentions. The 13 days of nuclear brinkmanship had revealed dangerous gaps in America's ability to monitor Soviet activities, communicate with military commanders, and coordinate responses to rapidly changing circumstances. After the crisis ended, Kennedy had authorized a massive expansion of intelligence gathering and communication networks, much of it conducted in secret to avoid provoking Soviet countermeasures. Civilian contractors, former military personnel, and private citizens had been recruited to establish and maintain installations that would never appear on official government records. Margaret found references to something called the Civilian Communications Reserve, a classified program that had enlisted former military communications specialists to operate monitoring and relay stations throughout the American Southwest. The program had been so secret that most participants hadn't known the full scope of their activities, believing they were involved in civil defense or scientific research rather than intelligence operations. Clarence Wong's military background in the Signal Corps and cryptography made him a perfect candidate for such a program. His Chinese heritage, which might have been a liability in civilian employment during the racially charged 1960s, could have been an asset in intelligence work, providing linguistic capabilities and cultural insights that few other Americans possessed during the height of Cold War tensions with Communist China. Margaret discovered that the federal government had purchased or leased thousands of acres of Nevada desert during the early 1960s, often using private citizens as intermediaries to avoid public scrutiny. Property records from that era were incomplete and often deliberately obscured, making it difficult to determine which lands had been acquired for classified purposes. But patterns were emerging from Margaret's research that made her hands shake with excitement and fear. Properties purchased in 1962 and 1963 by individuals with military communications backgrounds, located in remote areas within 50 miles of known government installations, held continuously for decades without development or sale. These characteristics appeared repeatedly in the fragmentary records she could access. Margaret found a declassified CIA document from 1975 that referenced long-term civilian assets maintaining communication capabilities in strategic locations throughout the American Southwest. The document noted that these installations had been essential to national security during the Cuban crisis and subsequent tensions with Soviet forces, but provided no details about locations, personnel, or current operational status. Another document, this one from the National Security Agency and declassified only in 2018, mentioned ongoing coordination with civilian communication specialists recruited during the 1962 emergency expansion of intelligence capabilities. The document was heavily redacted, but Margaret could make out references to Nevada installations, Signal Corps veterans, and long-term operational security requirements. The picture that was emerging from Margaret's research was both thrilling and terrifying. Clarence Wong appeared to have been part of a classified network of civilian intelligence operatives who had been recruited during the Cuban Missile Crisis to establish and maintain communication installations throughout the Nevada desert. These installations had operated for decades, possibly until Clarence's death, as part of America's Cold War intelligence infrastructure. If Margaret's hypothesis was correct, the mysterious rectangular anomaly visible in satellite photos of her inherited property wasn't a natural formation or an old mining claim. It was the remains of a classified intelligence installation that had been buried and concealed after its operational mission had ended. But Margaret's research was also revealing how dangerous such discoveries could be. She found numerous references to classified programs that had remained secret for decades after the Cold War ended, with severe criminal penalties for anyone who disclosed information about ongoing or former intelligence operations. The espionage. Act, the Official Secrets Act, and numerous other federal laws made it a serious crime to possess or disclose classified information, regardless of how that information had been obtained. Margaret was beginning to realize that her worthless inheritance might actually be a legal minefield that could land her in federal prison if she wasn't extremely careful about how she proceeded. Even if the installation had been decommissioned decades ago, any documents or equipment that remained on the property could still be classified, and mere possession of such materials could be prosecuted as a federal crime. At the same time, Margaret was discovering that historical evidence of Cold War intelligence operations could be incredibly valuable to researchers, journalists, and institutions that specialized in declassified government documents. The National Security Archive at George Washington University, the Cold War International History Project, and numerous academic institutions paid substantial sums for authenticated documents that shed new light on classified government activities. If Margaret's property contained legitimate historical evidence of Cold War intelligence operations, it could potentially be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to the right buyers, enough money to transform her financial situation and provide security for the rest of her life. But first, she had to determine whether there was actually anything on the property beyond empty desert and her own overactive imagination. Margaret spent Thursday evening making practical preparations for her Nevada expedition. She researched the route from Sacramento to the coordinates in Nye County, identifying gas stations, motels, and potential emergency services along the way. The property was located roughly 4 hours southeast of Sacramento, in an area so remote that the nearest town was 30 miles away and had a population of fewer than 200 people. Cell phone coverage would be non-existent in the area around her. In property, GPS signals might be unreliable. If her car broke down or she had a medical emergency, it could be hours or days before anyone found her. Margaret was planning to travel alone into one of the most isolated areas in the continental United States, chasing a mystery that might not exist, carrying equipment she didn't know how to use, with no backup plan if things went wrong. The rational part of Margaret's mind kept insisting that she was making a terrible mistake. She couldn't afford to miss work, couldn't afford the gas money for the trip, and certainly couldn't afford the potential legal consequences if she discovered classified materials on the property. The smart thing would be to sign the papers transferring the property to the state and focus on the daily struggle of survival in Sacramento. But Margaret had been making rational decisions her entire adult life. And where had it gotten her? She'd worked steadily, saved money, followed rules, and trusted that responsible behavior would be rewarded with security and stability. Instead, she'd lost everything to medical bankruptcy and was now living in poverty despite doing everything she'd been taught would lead to success. Maybe it was time to stop being rational and start taking risks. Maybe it was time to bet everything on the possibility that Clarence Wong had left her something more valuable than worthless desert land. Margaret withdrew another $200 from her checking account, reducing her balance to $600, barely enough to cover rent and utilities for the month. She used the cash to buy camping supplies, additional water containers, a better flashlight, and a small digital camera that could document whatever she might find on the property. She also visited the Sacramento Public Library to research Nevada, mining laws, property rights, and federal regulations governing archaeological discoveries on private land. What she learned was both encouraging and alarming. As the property owner, Margaret had the right to explore and excavate her own land, but any artifacts or structures of historical significance could potentially be subject to federal oversight or seizure. The Antiquities Act, the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, and numerous other federal laws gave the government broad authority to claim jurisdiction over historically significant discoveries, even on private property. If Margaret found evidence of classified government activities, she might find herself in a legal battle with federal agencies that had unlimited resources and decades of experience in suppressing inconvenient information. But Margaret also discovered that property owners who made significant historical discoveries often received substantial compensation when their finds were acquired by museums, universities, or government agencies. The key was documenting everything carefully, following proper legal procedures, and working with legitimate institutions rather than trying to profit from potentially classified materials through black market sales. Margaret spent Friday morning making final preparations for her trip. She packed methodically, including everything she might need for a multi-day desert expedition: tent, sleeping bag, cooking equipment, first aid supplies, emergency beacon, solar charger for her phone, and enough food and water for several days of self-sufficiency. She also packed tools that might be useful for excavation or exploration: shovel, pickaxe, metal detector borrowed from a neighbor, measuring tape, plastic bags for collecting samples, and the digital camera for documenting any discoveries. If there really was something buried on her property, Margaret intended to approach its investigation systematically and professionally. Before leaving Sacramento, Margaret made two important phone calls. The first was to Jessica, her daughter in Portland. "Mum, are you sure you should be doing this alone?" Jessica asked when Margaret explained her plans in carefully vague terms. "I could drive down and come with you. I don't like the idea of you camping alone in the desert." "I'll be fine, sweetheart," Margaret replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "It's just a quick trip to look at the property and decide whether to keep it or transfer it to the state. I'll have my cell, phone, and I'll check in with you every day." It was partially true, but Margaret didn't mention her suspicions about buried installations or classified documents. No point in worrying Jessica about possibilities that might turn out to be fantasy. The second call was to her sister Ellen in Phoenix, providing an emergency contact and rough itinerary in case something went wrong. Ellen thought Margaret was making a mistake. Why would anyone drive into the desert to look at worthless land, but agreed to serve as backup if Margaret didn't check in as scheduled? By Friday afternoon, Margaret was ready to leave Sacramento. Her Honda Civic was packed with supplies, her route was planned, and her research was as complete as she could make it without actually visiting the property. She'd learned everything she could about Clarence Wong, Cold War intelligence operations, Nevada mining laws, and federal regulations governing archaeological discoveries. What she hadn't learned was whether any of her theories and suspicions were based in reality or were simply the desperate fantasies of a woman who couldn't accept that her inheritance was exactly what it appeared to be: 47 acres of worthless desert that would cost more in taxes than it would ever be worth. Margaret looked around her studio apartment one final time, taking inventory of the life she was temporarily leaving behind. The cramped space that had felt like a prison cell for months now seemed like a refuge compared to the unknown challenges waiting in the Nevada desert. Her Murphy bed, her tiny kitchenette, her stack of unpaid bills, all of it suddenly felt safe and familiar compared to the adventure she was about to undertake. But Margaret had made her decision, and she'd learned during David's illness that second-guessing herself was a luxury she couldn't afford. Sometimes you had to make choices, with incomplete information and live with the consequences. Sometimes you had to bet everything on possibilities that might not pan out, because the alternative was accepting defeat without a fight. Margaret locked her apartment, loaded her final supplies into the Honda, and began the 4-hour drive toward coordinates that might represent the discovery of a lifetime or the biggest mistake she'd ever made. As she merged onto Interstate 80 heading east, Margaret tried not to think about all the ways her Nevada expedition could go wrong. Car trouble in the desert, getting lost without cell phone coverage, finding nothing but empty land and wasting money she couldn't afford to lose, discovering classified materials that would land her in federal prison, encountering hazardous materials or dangerous wildlife in an area where no one would find her for days. Instead, Margaret focused on the possibilities that had kept her awake for 2 nights running. What if Clarence Wong really had been part of a classified intelligence network? What if her property contained a buried installation with historical documents that could shed new light on the Cuban Missile Crisis? What if her worthless inheritance was actually the discovery that would transform her life and provide the financial security that had been destroyed by medical bankruptcy? The Nevada desert was waiting, along with answers to questions that had been buried for 60 years. Margaret Chen was about to find out whether desperate curiosity and careful research could uncover secrets that the United States government had spent decades trying to keep hidden. The 4-hour drive would give her time to prepare mentally for whatever she might find on 47 acres of supposedly empty desert. By tomorrow morning, Margaret would know whether her theories about Clarence Wong and his mysterious property were based in reality or were simply the elaborate fantasies of a woman who couldn't accept that sometimes worthless things were exactly as worthless as they appeared to be. But Margaret had a feeling, a mixture of intuition and desperate hope, that Clarence Wong's final gift to a great niece he'd never met was going to be much more than worthless land with expensive tax obligations. Something had kept him paying those annual tax bills for 60 years, and Margaret was about to discover what that something was. The drive from Sacramento to the Nevada desert gave Margaret 4 hours to second-guess every decision that had led her to this moment. As her Honda Civic climbed through the Sierra Nevada foothills and descended into the vast emptiness of the Great Basin, the landscape gradually transformed from California's green valleys to Nevada's brown moonscape, and Margaret's confidence transformed from cautious optimism to creeping dread. What was she really doing? A 54-year-old widow with no experience in archaeology, historical research, or desert survival was driving alone into one of the most remote areas of the continental United States, chasing theories based on internet research and circumstantial evidence. She was burning through money she couldn't afford to lose, missing work she couldn't afford to miss, and pursuing possibilities that probably existed only in her desperate imagination. But something kept Margaret pressing forward, even as the rational voice in her head catalogued all the ways this expedition could end in disaster. Maybe it was the memory of David's final words, "Don't let them take everything." Maybe it was the crushing weight of poverty that made any risk seem worthwhile, compared to the certainty of slow financial strangulation. Maybe it was simply the first spark of hope she'd felt in months, and she couldn't bear to extinguish it without knowing for certain whether it might ignite something larger. The GPS navigation cut out somewhere south of Carson City, as Margaret had expected. Cell phone coverage disappeared entirely as she turned east onto increasingly smaller roads that led deeper into the Nevada wilderness. The pavement gave way to graded dirt, then to rough tracks that tested her Honda's suspension and made her grateful for the extra water she'd packed in case of radiator trouble. Margaret followed the route she'd plotted using paper maps and compass bearings, stopping frequently to check her position against landmarks and coordinate readings from her handheld GPS unit. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions. Brown hills rolling toward distant mountains, punctuated by the occasional Joshua tree or abandoned mining claim, marked by rusted equipment and weather-beaten signs, warning trespassers away. The isolation was both beautiful and terrifying. Margaret hadn't seen another vehicle for over an hour when she finally reached the approximate coordinates of Clarence Wong's property. According to her calculations, she was now somewhere near the center of the 47 acres that had legally belonged to her great-uncle for 60 years and now belonged to her for as long as she could afford the annual tax bills. Margaret parked her Honda on what appeared to be an old dirt track and climbed out to survey her inheritance. The first impression was exactly what she'd expected based on satellite photos. Nothing. Empty desert stretching to the horizon, broken only by scrub brush, scattered rocks, and the occasional animal trail. No buildings, no structures, no signs that humans had ever visited this particular patch of Nevada wasteland. But Margaret had learned during David's illness that first impressions were often misleading, and that finding the truth required patient investigation of details that weren't immediately obvious. She unpacked her metal detector, digital camera, and excavation tools, then began a systematic survey of the property boundaries. The legal description from the inheritance documents indicated that Clarence's property was roughly rectangular, measuring approximately 1,320 feet by 1,500 feet. Margaret used her GPS unit and measuring tape to identify the approximate corners and boundaries, marking them with fluorescent survey tape so she could conduct an organized search pattern. It was while establishing the eastern boundary that Margaret noticed something that made her heart race with excitement. The ground in that area wasn't quite level. There were subtle variations in elevation that suggested something had been buried and backfilled, then settled unevenly over the decades. The vegetation was also different, with certain plants growing in patterns that indicated different soil conditions or water drainage than the surrounding area. Margaret had seen similar patterns during the landscaping projects she and David had undertaken at their former house. When you buried something large, a septic tank, a swimming pool, underground utilities, the disturbed earth settled differently than the original soil, creating subtle but persistent differences in surface topography and vegetation patterns that could last for decades. But what really caught Margaret's attention was a series of metal objects barely visible beneath decades of accumulated sand and debris. She used her metal detector to trace what appeared to be a rectangular pattern of buried metal, roughly 30 feet by 20 feet, located near the center of the property. Margaret began carefully excavating one corner of the rectangular pattern, using her shovel to remove sand and debris while documenting everything with photographs and GPS coordinates. What she found made her hands tremble with excitement and disbelief. Buried 3 feet beneath the surface was a concrete structure, clearly man-made, professionally constructed, and definitely not a natural formation or abandoned mining equipment. The concrete was high quality, reinforced with steel rebar, and showed signs of having been poured by skilled contractors rather than improvised by amateur builders. Margaret worked methodically, expanding her excavation along the edges of the buried structure while taking photographs and measurements at every step. What gradually emerged was the outline of what appeared to be an underground bunker or installation, with concrete walls extending deeper than she could safely excavate with hand tools. Even more intriguingly, Margaret discovered that one corner of the structure contained what appeared to be an access hatch or entrance, a heavy metal door set into the concrete, secured with a locking mechanism that looked like military surplus equipment from the 1960s. Margaret stared at her discovery, trying to process the implications. She had definitely found something that had been deliberately buried and concealed on Clarence Wong's property. The construction quality and materials suggested government or military involvement. The timing of the property purchase in 1962 matched perfectly with the expansion of classified installations throughout Nevada during the height of the Cold War. But Margaret also realized she was now facing decisions and risks she hadn't fully anticipated. If this really was a classified government installation, even an abandoned one, exploring it could potentially violate federal laws regarding access to restricted facilities. On the other hand, the installation was located on private property that she legally owned, and she had every right to investigate structures on her own land. Margaret spent the rest of the afternoon carefully documenting the buried installation while trying to determine the safest way to proceed. The metal door appeared to be locked, but the locking mechanism looked like it might be accessible with the right tools. The concrete structure seemed to extend at least 10 feet underground, suggesting a substantial facility rather than just a simple storage bunker. Most importantly, Margaret could see signs that the installation had been designed for long-term use rather than temporary storage. Ventilation shafts extended upward from the buried structure, disguised as natural rock formations, but clearly artificial when examined closely. Power cables, now corroded but still visible, had once connected the installation to some external source of electricity. As the sun began to set over the Nevada desert, Margaret made the decision that would change everything. She was going to find a way into the underground installation, document whatever she found inside, and deal with the legal and practical consequences afterward. She'd come too far and risked too much to turn back now without exploring the most significant discovery of her life. Margaret set up her tent near the excavation site and prepared for what might be several days of exploration and documentation. She'd brought enough supplies for extended camping, and the remote location meant she could work without interruption or observation. If the installation contained historically significant materials, she wanted to document everything thoroughly before deciding how to report her discovery to appropriate authorities. But first, she needed to get inside the buried facility, and that was going to require tools and techniques she hadn't anticipated when planning her Nevada expedition. Margaret spent Saturday morning expanding her excavation to fully expose the access door and its locking mechanism. The door was made of heavy steel, painted with what appeared to be military specification primer and coating that had largely resisted 60 years of burial. The lock was a substantial mechanism that looked like it required either a key or combination to open. Margaret tried the obvious combinations. 1962, the year Clarence had purchased the property. 10/25, his birth date. Various dates related to the Cuban Missile Crisis and other Cold War events. Nothing worked. The locking mechanism appeared to be in good condition despite its age, suggesting that the installation had been sealed and maintained until relatively recently. But Margaret noticed something interesting about the door frame and surrounding concrete. There were small gaps where the metal door met the concrete structure, gaps that had probably been sealed originally but had developed over the decades as materials expanded and contracted with temperature changes. The gaps were small, but they might be large enough to provide access if Margaret was willing to take some risks. Margaret spent the afternoon rigging a pulley system using rope and the anchor points on her Honda Civic, trying to create enough leverage to force the door open, without damaging whatever might be inside the installation. It was exhausting work in the desert heat, and Margaret had to rest frequently to avoid heat exhaustion, but gradually the old lock mechanism began to show signs of stress. Finally, with a grinding metallic sound that echoed across the empty desert, the lock gave way and the heavy door swung open on corroded hinges. Margaret stared into the darkness beyond the door, her heart pounding with excitement and terror. Cool air flowed out of the opening, carrying scents of metal, concrete, and something else, something that suggested the installation had been sealed and preserved rather than abandoned to decay. Margaret gathered her flashlights, camera, and documentation supplies, then took a deep breath and stepped through the doorway into what would prove to be one of the most significant historical discoveries of the 21st century. The installation was larger than Margaret had imagined based on her external excavation. A concrete stairway led down into a substantial underground facility that had clearly been designed for extended occupation and sophisticated operations. The construction quality was exceptional. Reinforced concrete walls, professional electrical systems, and ventilation equipment that suggested military or government engineering standards. Margaret descended the stairs carefully, using her flashlight to illuminate each step while documenting everything with photographs. The air was dry and surprisingly fresh, suggesting that the ventilation systems had continued operating until recently. Emergency lighting fixtures were mounted along the walls, connected to what appeared to be a backup power system that might still be functional. At the bottom of the stairs, Margaret found herself in what appeared to be the main operations room of a sophisticated communication and monitoring facility. The space was roughly 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, filled with equipment that looked like it belonged in a Cold War-era spy movie. Banks of radio equipment lined the walls, transceivers, monitoring receivers, and communication devices that were clearly more advanced than anything available to civilian users during the 1960s. Computer equipment that must have been state-of-the-art for its era occupied several workstations, along with typewriters, filing cabinets, and map displays that covered entire wall sections. But what made Margaret's knees weak with shock and excitement was the realization that much of the equipment appeared to be in working condition. Dust covers protected sensitive instruments. Documentation and operating manuals were stored in sealed containers. Most incredibly, indicator lights on several pieces of equipment were still glowing, suggesting that power was somehow still being supplied to the installation 60 years after its construction. Margaret moved through the facility methodically, photographing everything while trying to understand the scope and purpose of what Clarence Wong had been protecting for 6 decades. This wasn't just a communications station or monitoring post. It was a sophisticated intelligence facility that had clearly played a significant role in Cold War operations. Filing cabinets contained thousands of documents, many marked with classification. Stamps and security warnings. Map displays showed detailed intelligence about Soviet military installations, Chinese nuclear facilities, and communication networks throughout the communist world. Technical manuals described procedures for intercepting and decoding foreign communications, monitoring nuclear weapons tests, and coordinating with other classified installations throughout the American Southwest. Margaret found personnel records indicating that the facility had been staffed by a small team of specialists, all with military communications backgrounds and top-secret security clearances. Clarence Wong was listed as the site commander, responsible for overall operations and coordination with higher authorities in Washington, D.C. But the most shocking discovery was a series of documents dated October 1962, the exact period of the Cuban Missile Crisis. These files contained detailed intelligence about Soviet missile deployments in Cuba, transcripts of intercepted Soviet communications, and what appeared to be real-time reports that had been transmitted to the White House Situation Room during the 13 days when the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. Margaret sat in the underground facility, surrounded by evidence that her great-uncle had been a key participant in one of the most critical episodes in human history, and tried to process the magnitude of what she'd discovered. This wasn't just a historical curiosity or an interesting Cold War artifact. This was documentation of presidential decision-making during the Cuban Missile Crisis that had never been made public. The documents suggested that Clarence Wong's facility had provided intelligence that directly influenced President Kennedy's decisions during the nuclear standoff with the Soviet Union. Intercepted communications, satellite imagery analysis, and strategic assessments that had been transmitted from this buried Nevada installation to the highest levels of the American government. Margaret realized she was now in possession of historical evidence that could, force historians to reconsider fundamental assumptions about how the Cuban Missile Crisis had been managed and resolved. Documents that might reveal presidential decision-making processes that had never been publicly acknowledged. Information that could shed new light on how close the world had actually come to nuclear war and what factors had ultimately pulled both superpowers back from the brink. But Margaret also realized she was now in possession of materials that were probably still classified at the highest levels of government security. Even though the Cold War had ended decades ago, intelligence methods and sources from that era often remained classified to protect ongoing operations and international relationships. As Margaret continued exploring the facility, she found evidence that operations had continued long after the Cuban Missile Crisis ended. Documents from the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s showed that the installation had been regularly updated and maintained, with new equipment installed and old systems upgraded as technology advanced. Most incredibly, Margaret found records indicating that the facility had remained operational until very recently, possibly until Clarence Wong's death in 2009. Maintenance logs, equipment testing records, and communication transcripts that were dated within the last 15 years. Margaret was beginning to understand that she hadn't just inherited worthless desert land, she'd inherited an active intelligence installation that had been operating continuously for nearly 50 years. Right up until her great-uncle's death had ended the operation and left the facility sealed and abandoned. As night fell over the Nevada desert, Margaret sat in the underground facility, surrounded by the most significant historical discovery she could have imagined, trying to figure out what to do with information that could rewrite Cold War history or land her in federal prison for the rest of her life. The opportunity she'd stumbled upon was bigger than anything she'd dared to hope for, but it was also more dangerous than anything she'd prepared to handle. Margaret Chen had set out to investigate worthless inherited land and had instead uncovered secrets that could change her life and potentially change how America understood its own history. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to report her discovery to authorities, try to profit from the historical materials, or simply seal the facility back up and pretend she'd never found it. But tonight, she was going to continue exploring and documenting what might be the most important intelligence facility discovery since the end of the Cold War. The buried installation had kept its secrets for 60 years, but Margaret Chen was about to bring them into the light, along with all the opportunities and dangers that such revelations would inevitably create. Margaret spent 3 days in the underground facility, working 18-hour shifts to document everything before, making the decision that would either transform her life or destroy it. She photographed thousands of documents, catalogued equipment serial numbers, and created detailed maps of the installation's layout and capabilities. What she discovered during those 3 days of intensive investigation would ultimately force the United States government to acknowledge one of the most significant intelligence operations in Cold War history. The scope of Clarence Wong's facility was staggering. This wasn't just a communication station or monitoring post. It was a sophisticated intelligence hub that had intercepted and decoded foreign communications, analyzed satellite imagery, coordinated with assets throughout the communist world, and provided real-time intelligence to the highest levels of the American government for nearly 50 years. Margaret found transcripts of intercepted Soviet communications from the Cuban Missile Crisis that had never been made public. Detailed intelligence assessments of Chinese nuclear capabilities from the 1960s and 1970s, evidence of covert operations in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War, documentation of intelligence sharing with allied countries that revealed the true extent of Western cooperation during the Cold War. But the most explosive discovery was a series of presidential briefing documents that showed how intelligence from Clarence's facility had directly influenced major foreign policy decisions. Kennedy's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Nixon's opening to China, Reagan's negotiations with Gorbachev, all had been shaped by intelligence gathered at this remote Nevada installation. Margaret realized she was holding evidence that could rewrite the history of American foreign policy during the nuclear age, documents that revealed the real story behind diplomatic successes and military conflicts that had shaped the modern world. Information that could expose decades of classified operations while potentially embarrassing governments and intelligence agencies in multiple countries. The weight of responsibility was crushing. Margaret was a widow living in poverty who had stumbled upon secrets that could reshape international relations if handled properly, or could result in her imprisonment or worse if handled badly. She had no experience with classified information, no connections in government or academia, and no resources to protect herself if powerful people decided her discovery was inconvenient. But Margaret also realized this was her only chance to escape the financial devastation that had consumed her life since David's death. The historical significance of her discovery made it potentially worth millions of dollars to the right buyers, government agencies, academic institutions, or international organizations that specialized in Cold War research. After 3 sleepless nights in the desert, surrounded by evidence of one of the most significant intelligence discoveries in modern American history, Margaret made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She was going to expose everything. Margaret's first call, made from a payphone in the nearest Nevada town after driving 2 hours from the facility, was to Dr. Sarah Chen at the National Security Archive at George Washington University. Dr. Chen, despite sharing Margaret's surname, was no relation, but she was one of the world's leading experts on declassified Cold War documents and had built her career on exposing previously unknown government operations. "Mrs. Chen," Dr. Sarah Chen said, after Margaret had explained her discovery in carefully vague terms, "What you're describing sounds extraordinary, but I need to warn you about the potential legal implications. If you found classified materials, even accidentally, you could be prosecuted under the Espionage Act, regardless of your intentions." "I understand the risks," Margaret replied, "but I also understand that this information belongs to the American people, not to government agencies that have kept it secret for 60 years. My great-uncle spent his entire adult life protecting these secrets. I think it's time the truth came out." Dr. Chen agreed to meet with Margaret in Las Vegas, along with a team of experts who specialized in authentication and legal protection for whistleblowers. Within a week, Margaret found herself in a casino hotel conference room surrounded by historians, lawyers, and former intelligence officials who were examining her photographs and documentation with expressions of disbelief and excitement. "This is authentic," Dr. James Morrison, a former NSA analyst, announced after examining Margaret's evidence. "I recognize some of these document formats and classification stamps from my time in government. This facility was definitely part of a compartmentalized intelligence program that I'd heard rumors about but never seen documented." "The legal situation is complex," added Jennifer Walsh, a civil liberties attorney who specialized in whistleblower protection. "The materials are probably still classified, but they're located on private property that you legally own. We can argue that you have property rights that supersede classification restrictions, especially for historical materials that are decades old." Margaret's discovery quickly attracted attention from journalists, academics, and government officials who had spent careers studying Cold War intelligence operations. Within a month, she was fielding calls from 60 Minutes, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and documentary filmmakers who wanted to tell the story of the Nevada facility and its role in shaping American foreign policy. But Margaret also attracted attention from government agencies that preferred to keep Cold War secrets buried. FBI agents visited her Sacramento apartment, asking questions about how she'd gained access to classified materials and warning her about the criminal penalties for disclosing national security information. Mrs. Chen, Agent Robert Martinez explained during one particularly tense interview, "We understand that you believe you're serving the public interest, but some of the materials you found could compromise ongoing intelligence operations and endanger American assets overseas. We are prepared to offer you substantial compensation for turning over all materials and agreeing to a non-disclosure agreement." Margaret's response surprised even herself. "Agent Martinez, I've spent the last year choosing between groceries and prescription medications because medical bills destroyed everything my husband and I worked for over 32 years. The government's idea of substantial compensation probably wouldn't cover my credit card debt, but this discovery could provide financial security for my family while ensuring that historically significant information reaches the American people who have a right to know what their government did during the Cold War." The legal battle that followed lasted 3 years and ultimately reached the Supreme Court. Margaret Chen v. United States became a landmark case that established important precedents for property rights versus national security classifications, whistleblower protections for accidental discoverers of classified information, and public access to historical materials of significant democratic importance. Margaret's legal team, funded by civil liberties organizations and academic institutions, argued that citizens had a constitutional right to know about government activities that had occurred decades earlier, especially when those activities had shaped major historical events like the Cuban Missile Crisis. The government argued that national security required continued protection of intelligence methods and sources, regardless of their age. The Supreme Court's 6-3 decision in Margaret's favor established that property owners had qualified rights to historical materials found on their own land, provided those materials were handled through appropriate academic and journalistic channels rather than sold to foreign governments or hostile actors. More importantly, the court ruled that the public interest in understanding government decision-making during critical historical periods outweighed classification protections for materials that were more than 25 years old and no longer posed legitimate national security risks. Margaret's victory opened the floodgates for one of the most significant releases of classified Cold War documents in American history. The Wong Papers, as they became known, filled in crucial gaps in the historical record and revealed the true extent of American intelligence capabilities during the nuclear age. The documents showed that the United States had been far more successful at penetrating Soviet and Chinese communications than previously known, but had also come much closer to nuclear war during several Cold War crises than had ever been publicly acknowledged. Presidential decision-making during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the 1973 Middle East War, and the 1983 Able Archer NATO exercise had all been influenced by intelligence from installations like Clarence Wong's Nevada facility. Margaret's discovery also revealed the existence of a network of similar installations throughout the American Southwest, operated by former military personnel who had been recruited during the Cuban Missile Crisis to establish and maintain long-term intelligence gathering capabilities. At least 17 other facilities were eventually located and investigated, yielding additional troves of historical documents that transformed understanding of Cold War intelligence operations. The financial impact of Margaret's discovery exceeded her wildest dreams. The National Security Archive, working with the Smithsonian Institution and several major universities, purchased her collection for $2.3 million. Documentary rights, book deals, and speaking engagements provided additional income that transformed Margaret from poverty to financial security within 5 years of her Nevada expedition. But the personal transformation was even more dramatic. Margaret Chen, who had been a desperate widow facing eviction and poverty, became one of the most important whistleblowers in modern American history. She testified before Congress about government secrecy and citizen rights. She lectured at universities about the importance of historical transparency. She established a foundation that provided legal support for other citizens who accidentally discovered classified information. The Margaret Chen Foundation, funded by her discovery and supported by civil liberties organizations, helped dozens of other Americans navigate the legal complexities of finding classified materials on private property, in inherited estates, or in abandoned government facilities. The Foundation's work led to the disclosure of additional Cold War secrets and established important precedents for balancing national security with democratic transparency. 10 years after her initial discovery, Margaret stood before a packed auditorium at the Kennedy Presidential Library, delivering the annual lecture on government accountability and citizen rights. The audience included historians, journalists, government officials, and ordinary citizens who had been inspired by her story to become more engaged in protecting democratic values. 10 years ago, Margaret began, I was a widow living in poverty, working 2 part-time jobs to afford a studio apartment, facing the choice between groceries and prescription medications. I inherited 47 acres of supposedly worthless Nevada desert and thought it was another burden I couldn't afford to bear. She clicked to a slide showing the original satellite image of her property with the barely visible rectangular anomaly that had started her investigation. What I found beneath that desert changed not only my life, but our understanding of how America navigated the most dangerous period in human history. The facility that my great-uncle Clarence Wong operated for nearly 50 years provided intelligence that helped prevent nuclear war while gathering information that shaped American foreign policy for decades. Margaret's next slide showed the Supreme Court decision that had established her right to disclose the materials, alongside photographs, of some of the thousands of documents that had been released to the public. But the most important discovery wasn't the historical documents or the intelligence equipment. It was the realization that ordinary citizens have both the power and the responsibility to hold their government accountable, even when, especially when, it's dangerous to do so. The audience was silent as Margaret described the legal battles, government pressure, and personal risks she'd faced in choosing to expose the truth about Cold War intelligence operations. But they erupted in applause when she described the ultimate outcome: congressional investigations that led to greater oversight of intelligence agencies, new protections for whistleblowers, and the declassification of thousands of documents that had enriched historical understanding of the nuclear age. Democracy survives not because of its institutions, Margaret concluded, but because of its citizens, people willing to ask difficult questions, demand honest answers, and risk personal security to protect democratic values. My great-uncle, Clarence Wong, spent 50 years keeping government secrets. I spent 3 years exposing them. Both of us served our country, but in very different ways. After her lecture, Margaret was approached by a young graduate student who reminded her of Jessica, earnest, idealistic, and concerned about government accountability in the digital age. Mrs. Chen, the student asked, do you ever regret making the discovery? Would you choose differently if you could go back? Margaret considered the question that she'd been asked hundreds of times over the past decade. I regret that my discovery came at the cost of so much personal stress and legal danger. I regret that my family had to live with security concerns and constant scrutiny for years. I regret that exposing the truth required such personal sacrifice. She paused, looking out at the audience of young faces who would inherit the democracy she'd helped to protect. But I don't regret the choice to expose what I found. Some secrets are too important to stay buried, and some truths are too significant to be left to government officials who prefer convenient lies to inconvenient realities. The Nevada facility had been converted into a museum and research center, preserved as a national historic landmark that educated visitors about Cold War intelligence operations and the importance of democratic oversight. Tour groups could walk through the installation, where Clarence Wong had spent decades intercepting Soviet communications and coordinating with intelligence agencies throughout the Western world. But the facility also served as a symbol of citizen vigilance and government accountability. A plaque near the entrance, installed at Margaret's request, read, "Democracy requires citizens willing to ask difficult questions and demand honest answers, even when powerful people prefer that some truths remain buried." Margaret's transformation from desperate widow to national whistleblower had taken place over 10 years that had changed both her life and American understanding of Cold War history. The worthless inheritance that had threatened to cost her $847 in annual property taxes had ultimately provided her with financial security, historical significance, and a legacy of democratic service that would outlast her lifetime. Jessica, now a practicing nurse and mother of two, often told her children about their grandmother who had found buried treasure in the Nevada desert. But the real treasure hadn't been the money or the historical significance. It had been the proof that ordinary citizens could make extraordinary differences when they chose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and democratic accountability over personal security. The satellite photos that had started Margaret's investigation now hung in the Smithsonian Institution, part of an exhibit on accidental discoveries that changed history. Visitors could see the barely visible rectangular anomaly that had caught a desperate widow's attention and led to one of the most significant intelligence disclosures in modern American history. But Margaret knew that the most important legacy of her discovery wasn't the museum exhibits or the historical documents. It was the proof that democracy survived because of citizens who were willing to take risks to protect it. Ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and chose to serve the greater good rather than their own immediate interests. The desert had given up its secrets after 60 years of silence. The truth had prevailed over government, secrecy, and Margaret Chen had learned that sometimes the most worthless-looking gifts contain the most valuable truths, and that American democracy depends on citizens who are brave enough to dig beneath the surface when something doesn't look quite right. Her great-uncle Clarence Wong had spent his life keeping secrets. Margaret Chen had transformed her life by revealing them. Both had served their country, but Margaret's service had reminded America that in a democracy, the people have the right to know what their government does in their name, even when, especially, when the truth is inconvenient for those in power. The worthless land had become priceless history. The desperate widow had become a guardian of democracy, and the buried secrets had become a reminder that in America, citizens still have the power to hold their government accountable, one inconvenient truth at a time. 15 years had passed since Margaret Chen first received that certified letter about inheriting worthless Nevada desert land, and as she stood in the Oval Office shaking hands with President Sarah Williams, she could barely recognize the desperate widow who had once counted quarters to do laundry in a Sacramento apartment complex. "Mrs. Chen," President Williams said, her voice carrying the weight of historical significance, "it is my honor to present you with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian award in the United States, in recognition of your extraordinary service to American democracy and your courageous commitment to government transparency and accountability." The East Room was packed with dignitaries, journalists, and family members who had gathered to witness Margaret receive the nation's highest civilian honor. Jessica sat in the front row with her 3 children, beaming with pride at her mother's transformation from struggling widow to national hero. The grandchildren, David Jr., Sarah, and little Clarence, represented the future that Margaret's courage had helped to secure. But as President Williams placed the medal around Margaret's neck, Margaret's thoughts drifted back to the chain of seemingly impossible events that had led from an $847 property tax bill to this moment in the most powerful office in the world. The Margaret Chen Foundation had grown into one of the most influential watchdog organizations in American politics, with an annual budget of $12 million and a staff of 47 researchers, lawyers, and activists dedicated to government transparency and whistleblower protection. The foundation had been instrumental in exposing dozens of classified programs, protecting hundreds of citizen whistleblowers, and forcing the declassification of over 200,000 pages of historical documents. But perhaps more importantly, Margaret's story had inspired a generation of Americans to become active participants in protecting democratic institutions. The Chen effect, as political scientists had termed it, described the phenomenon of ordinary citizens becoming more engaged in government oversight and accountability after learning about Margaret's accidental discovery and subsequent legal victory. High school civics classes now studied Margaret's case as an example of how individual citizens could hold government accountable. Law schools taught courses on the Chen v. United States decision and its implications for balancing national security with democratic transparency. Intelligence agencies had been forced to adopt new procedures for handling historical materials and responding to accidental disclosures by private citizens. The Clarence Wong Memorial Intelligence Museum, built on the site of the Nevada facility, had become one of the most visited Cold War historical sites in the United States. Over 300,000 people annually toured the underground installation, where Margaret's great-uncle had spent decades intercepting Soviet communications and coordinating intelligence operations that had shaped American foreign policy for half a century. But the museum served a purpose beyond historical education. It had become a pilgrimage site for citizens who were struggling with their own decisions about whether to expose government wrongdoing, corporate malfeasance, or institutional corruption. The museum's guest book contained thousands of entries, from visitors who had been inspired by Margaret's story to take risks in service of truth and accountability. Reading about Mrs. Chen's courage gave me the strength to report safety violations at my company, wrote Maria Rodriguez from Phoenix. 3 people are alive today because Margaret Chen showed me that ordinary people can make a difference. I was afraid to speak up about corruption in my city government until I learned about the Nevada discovery, added James Thompson from Michigan. Margaret Chen proved that citizens have both the power and responsibility to protect democracy. The ripple effects of Margaret's discovery had extended far beyond American borders. International transparency organizations had used the Chen case as precedent for demanding greater government accountability in countries throughout the world. The European Union had passed comprehensive transparency legislation, partly inspired by Margaret's legal victory. The United Nations had established new protocols for handling historically significant classified materials based on principles established in the Chen versus United States decision. Most significantly, Margaret's story had demonstrated that the most powerful weapon against government secrecy wasn't sophisticated technology or massive resources. It was the curiosity and courage of individual citizens who refused to accept official explanations when something didn't look quite right. After the Medal of Freedom ceremony, Margaret was approached by Dr. Elena Vasquez, a young political scientist from Stanford University who was writing a book about citizen activism in the digital age. "Mrs. Chen," Dr. Vasquez asked, "looking back over 15 years, what do you think has been the most important outcome of your discovery?" Margaret considered the question carefully. She'd been asked similar questions thousands of times, but the answer continued to evolve as she watched the long-term consequences of her decision to expose the Nevada facility. "The documents were historically significant," Margaret replied. "The legal precedent was important for protecting future whistleblowers. The financial compensation transformed my family's circumstances. But I think the most important outcome has been proving to ordinary Americans that they have the power to change history when they're willing to ask difficult questions and pursue uncomfortable truths." Margaret's influence had extended into unexpected areas of American life. Business schools taught case studies about how her methodical approach to research and documentation had enabled her to navigate complex legal and political challenges. Engineering programs used her systematic investigation of the Nevada property as an example of how to approach unknown problems with limited resources and high stakes. Environmental groups had adopted Margaret's techniques for investigating potentially contaminated sites, using similar combinations of historical research, satellite imagery analysis, and careful documentation to expose corporate pollution and government cover-ups. Civil rights organizations had used her legal strategies to force disclosure of historical documents related to surveillance of minority communities and political dissidents. The Margaret Chen Institute for Democratic Accountability, established at George Washington University with funding from her discovery, had become the premier training center for investigative journalists, transparency advocates, and citizen activists. The Institute's fellowship program brought together students from around the world to study techniques for exposing government secrecy and corporate malfeasance while protecting sources and avoiding legal retaliation. But perhaps the most profound impact of Margaret's story had been its demonstration that heroism didn't require special qualifications, extraordinary resources, or unique circumstances. Margaret had been an ordinary widow facing financial crisis, who had stumbled onto something extraordinary and had chosen to pursue truth despite personal risk and uncertainty. Her example had inspired countless other Americans to investigate suspicious circumstances in their own communities, from environmental contamination to government corruption to corporate fraud. The Margaret Chen method, careful research, systematic documentation, legal protection, and principled disclosure, had become a template for citizen activism that had exposed wrongdoing in dozens of communities across the country. As Margaret prepared to leave the White House after receiving the nation's highest civilian honor, she reflected on the conversation she'd had with David during his final days in the hospital. He'd made her promise not to let them take everything, referring to the medical bills and financial devastation that were consuming their life savings. Margaret had kept that promise in ways that neither of them could have imagined. She'd not only recovered from financial ruin, but had used her discovery to protect other Americans from government overreach and institutional abuse. She'd transformed personal tragedy into public service, individual loss into collective gain. The drive back to her home in Virginia, a comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood, purchased with proceeds from her discovery, gave Margaret time to think about the letter she'd received that morning from a young woman in Oregon whose grandmother had recently died, leaving behind a basement full of old documents that might be historically significant. "Mrs. Chen," the letter had read, "I've read about your discovery and your legal victory, and I'm hoping you can provide advice about how to handle potentially important historical materials. My grandmother worked for the government during World War II, and after she died we found boxes of documents in her basement that have official stamps and seem like they might be classified. I don't know if they're important, but after reading your story, I think someone should look at them. Can you help me figure out what to do?" Margaret had received hundreds of similar letters over the years from citizens who had found potentially significant materials in inherited estates, abandoned properties, or forgotten storage spaces. Each letter reminded her that history was full of secrets waiting to be discovered by ordinary people who were curious enough to investigate and brave enough to reveal what they found. The Margaret Chen Foundation now operated a hotline for citizens who discovered potentially classified or historically significant materials, providing legal advice, expert evaluation, and protection for people who found themselves in possession of sensitive information. The Foundation's lawyers had successfully defended dozens of cases involving accidental discovery of government secrets, establishing a network of legal precedents that protected curious citizens while ensuring that legitimate national security interests were respected. But Margaret's greatest satisfaction came from the letters she received from young people who had been inspired by her story to pursue careers in journalism, law, academia, or public service. Students who had chosen their life paths because they wanted to continue the work that Margaret had begun in the Nevada desert. "I'm studying investigative journalism because of your example," wrote Ashley Kim from Northwestern University. "You showed me that asking the right questions can change the world. Your story convinced me to become a civil rights lawyer," added Marcus Williams from Harvard Law School. "I want to help protect other whistleblowers who have the courage to expose inconvenient truths." Margaret had established scholarship programs at 12 universities, providing financial support for students who were committed to careers in government, accountability, investigative journalism, and democratic reform. The scholarship recipients, known as Chen Scholars, were required to spend part of their education working with the Margaret Chen Foundation, learning practical techniques for exposing government secrecy while protecting sources and avoiding legal retaliation. The scholarship program had already produced 3 Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists, 2 federal judges who specialized in transparency law, and a member of Congress who had authored landmark legislation expanding whistleblower protections and government accountability requirements. As Margaret pulled into her driveway, she noticed that her mailbox was full, as usual, with letters from citizens seeking advice, researchers requesting interviews, and students asking for guidance on their own investigations into government secrecy and institutional corruption. But the letter that caught her attention was from a familiar address, the same law firm in Nevada that had originally notified her about inheriting Clarence Wong's property 15 years earlier. "Dear Mrs. Chen," the letter began, "we are writing to inform you about another property inheritance that may be of interest to you. Our client, Dr. Robert Tanaka, recently passed away and has left you 43 acres of land in southeastern Arizona. Dr. Tanaka was apparently a colleague of your great-uncle Clarence Wong during their military service, and he specifically requested that his property be left to you because of your work in preserving Cold War history." Margaret stared at the letter, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Another mysterious inheritance from another unknown relative connected to Cold War intelligence operations. Another potentially worthless piece of desert land that might contain buried secrets waiting to be discovered. But this time, Margaret wasn't a desperate widow facing financial ruin and grasping at any possibility for escape from poverty. She was an experienced investigator with resources, legal protection, and a team of experts who could help her navigate whatever she might discover. Margaret called her daughter Jessica, who had become the operational director of the Margaret Chen Foundation, and Margaret's most trusted advisor on matters involving historical discoveries and their implications. "Mom," Jessica said, after Margaret explained the new inheritance letter, "are you seriously considering another desert expedition? You're 70 years old, you've already made the discovery of a lifetime, and you have nothing left to prove to anyone." Margaret laughed, remembering her younger self standing in a Sacramento apartment, staring at a similar letter and wondering whether she could afford the property taxes on supposedly worthless land. "Jessica," Margaret replied, "I didn't go to Nevada 15 years ago to prove anything to anyone else. I went because I was curious about something that didn't make sense, and because I couldn't afford not to investigate possibilities that might change our circumstances. This feels similar, but for different reasons." "What do you mean?" 15 years ago, I had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Today, I have everything to lose and nothing material to gain. But I also have resources and experience that I didn't have then, and maybe this Dr. Tanaka left me something that needs to be preserved for history, rather than buried with his secrets. Margaret had learned that Cold War intelligence operations had been far more extensive and interconnected than anyone had realized before her Nevada discovery. If Dr. Tanaka had been Clarence Wong's colleague, his Arizona property might contain additional pieces of the historical puzzle that Margaret had begun assembling 15 years earlier. More importantly, Margaret had learned that democratic institutions were only as strong as the citizens who were willing to protect them. If there were more buried secrets waiting to be discovered, more historical truths waiting to be revealed, more government activities waiting to be subjected to democratic oversight, then Margaret felt obligated to continue the work that had become her life's mission. "Besides," Margaret added, "I'm not talking about doing this alone. The Foundation has a team of researchers, legal experts, and historical specialists who can handle the investigation professionally. And if there's nothing there, we'll know definitively. If there is something significant, we'll handle it properly." Within a month, Margaret found herself leading a convoy of vehicles towards southeastern Arizona, accompanied by a team of graduate students, legal observers, and documentary filmmakers, who were recording what might be the next chapter in her extraordinary story of accidental historical discovery. The Arizona property was located in an even more remote area than Clarence Wong's Nevada installation, in desert that hadn't seen rain in months and was populated mainly by rattlesnakes, scorpions, and the occasional illegal border crosser seeking a path to a better life. But Margaret's team was equipped with sophisticated ground-penetrating radar, professional excavation equipment, and communication systems that would allow them to work safely in the dangerous desert environment. What had been a desperate solo expedition 15 years earlier was now a carefully planned scientific investigation supported by academic institutions and legal experts. The initial radar scans revealed what appeared to be another buried installation, larger and more complex than the Nevada facility. If Margaret's hypothesis was correct, Dr. Tanaka had operated a different type of intelligence installation, possibly focused on monitoring activities along the Mexican border or coordinating with intelligence assets in Latin America. As Margaret's team began the careful excavation process that would reveal whatever Dr. Tanaka had spent decades protecting, she reflected on the incredible journey that had begun with a certified letter about worthless desert land and was now continuing with another mysterious inheritance from another unknown relative. But this time, Margaret wasn't a desperate woman chasing her last hope for financial salvation. She was an experienced investigator, following leads in a historical mystery that could shed additional light on how America had conducted intelligence operations during the most dangerous period in human history. Margaret Chen had learned that democracy survived not because of its institutions, but because of its citizens, people willing to ask difficult questions, pursue inconvenient truths, and risk personal security to protect democratic values. Her first discovery had established that principle. Her second investigation would test whether the lesson had been learned by the American people and their government. The Arizona desert stretched endlessly toward the horizon, holding secrets that had been buried as long as those in Nevada. But this time, Margaret wasn't alone in the desert with hand tools and desperate hope. She was leading a professional team equipped with the resources and legal protections that her first discovery had made possible. Margaret Chen had transformed. From accidental discoverer to professional guardian of democratic accountability, the worthless land had become priceless history. The desperate widow had become America's most celebrated whistleblower. And the buried secrets had become proof that in a democracy, citizens have both the power and the responsibility to ensure that government serves the people rather than the other way around. As Margaret's team began uncovering what would prove to be Dr. Tanaka's equally significant contribution to Cold War intelligence operations, she knew that her legacy was secure regardless of what they found in the Arizona desert. She had proven that ordinary Americans could make extraordinary differences when they chose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and democratic accountability over personal security. The game had been played, and democracy had won. But Margaret Chen had learned that the game never really ended. It just moved to new challenges, new discoveries, and new opportunities for citizens to choose between complacency and courage. She had chosen courage 15 years ago, when she had nothing left to lose. She was choosing courage again today, when she had everything to lose, because she had learned that protecting democracy was worth any personal risk, and that American citizens had both the power and the responsibility to hold their government accountable. The second desert was giving up its secrets just as the first one had. And Margaret Chen was proving once again that the most powerful weapon against government secrecy wasn't sophisticated technology or unlimited resources. It was the curiosity and courage of citizens who refused to accept that some truths were too dangerous for democracy to handle. Her transformation was complete, but her mission continued. Margaret Chen, guardian of American democracy, was still asking the difficult questions that powerful people preferred not to answer. And America was stronger because she had chosen to dig beneath the surface when something didn't look quite right. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.